POV, you're running an underground casino empire. Your phone buzzes at 3 in the morning with a simple text: "We have a problem." You don't ask what kind of problem, because in your line of work, there's only one kind that matters: the kind that ends with someone disappearing, or the kind that ends with you disappearing. You're the casino king of a city that doesn't officially exist on any gaming commission paperwork, and problems are just overhead you haven't accounted for yet. Let's talk about how you got here. 6 months ago, you were managing a legitimate poker room at a hotel on the edge of town. You were good at it, really good. You understood that gambling isn't actually about cards, it's about control. It's about knowing what people want more than they want money, and then offering it to them one bet at a time. Your pit bosses respected you. Your bosses respected you. Your ex-wife was still returning your calls sometimes. And then you realized something that changed everything. The legitimate poker room was making about 40% of what an actual underground operation could make, and 100% of the legal risk. So you quit. The first location was the basement of a Korean barbecue restaurant in the warehouse district. The owner owed money to people who didn't file lawsuits, so the arrangement was simple. You'd run the tables, you'd pay him 15%, and he'd have plausible deniability because he genuinely wouldn't know what was happening directly below his kimchi station. That first week, you had 43 people sitting at tables with a combined $2 million in chips on the felt. By the second week, that number had doubled. And here's where it gets interesting. Nobody called the police. This is the thing about underground casinos that the legitimate gaming industry doesn't want you to understand. People don't report them because the people who would report them are the ones losing money. And losing money is embarrassing. And you can't very well tell the authorities that you got fleeced in an illegal gambling operation without admitting you were in an illegal gambling operation. The people running them don't report each other because there's an unofficial code. You steal from the house, you disappear. You cheat, you disappear. You inform on someone, you disappear faster. By month 2, you'd expanded to 3 locations: a back room at a laundromat, 2 private homes in the suburbs where the owners had decided that the monthly envelope you left on their kitchen counter was substantially better than their actual mortgage payments. You hired dealers, real dealers, the kind who'd worked at casinos in Vegas and Atlantic City and had decided that the overhead of loyalty was cheaper than the overhead of permits. You brought in security, not the kind with badges, the kind with the specific and wordless understanding that their job was to ensure that everyone who left the building had the same number of fingers they arrived with, and if that had to change, it changed very quietly. By month 3, you were operating 11 separate games across the city. You had players who flew in from out of state. You had a plastic surgeon and a federal judge and a real estate developer who was already corrupt before he started coming to your tables, but was substantially more corrupt now. You had a system where money was laundered through the legitimate poker room, the one you used to run, using a manager you'd trained yourself, a woman named Claire who understood that the only difference between money and laundered money is paperwork and silence. Everything was working perfectly, which meant disaster was inevitable. It always is. The problem, it turned out, was a kid, 24 years old, bought himself $100,000 in chips using inherited money from his grandmother's estate, and then proceeded to lose it in 4 hours at a Texas Hold'em table. The kid wasn't upset about the money, his family had money, but he was upset about the principle. He couldn't accept that he'd been beaten by players who were simply better than him. He couldn't accept that he'd miscalculated his own abilities. So instead of accepting it, he called his father. His father was a lawyer, an actual, legitimate lawyer with clients and ethics and a business license. His father made a phone call to someone, and that someone made a phone call to someone else, and suddenly there was attention on your operation that you hadn't budgeted for. Not police attention, not yet, but the kind of attention that comes from people who collect taxes on things that exist outside of taxes. You got the call from one of your location managers at the laundromat. A man had come in, quiet, professional. He'd sat down at a high-stakes table and won exactly enough money to establish that he understood poker. Then he'd left, and when he left, he'd left a business card. The card had a name and a phone number and nothing else. The name was Marco Delgado. You know who Marco Delgado is because everybody in the city knows who Marco Delgado is. Marco Delgado is the person you pay when you're running something that technically doesn't exist, and you want to ensure that it continues to technically not exist. Marco Delgado is the person who runs the actual organized crime operation that controls protection in your sector. Marco Delgado is the person who decides whether you live in his territory or whether you don't. You've been avoiding exactly this conversation for 6 months. You call the number. Marco's voice is surprisingly soft. He congratulates you on your success. He tells you that he's been impressed by your operation. He's heard that you run things clean, that your players trust you, that your dealers don't steal, and that you've created something that's actually valuable rather than just dangerous. He says this with the tone of someone complimenting a restaurant, and then he tells you the problem. A member of the Gaming Commission, not a member of your operation, but a member of the government's Gaming Commission, was in one of your locations 3 weeks ago. He was there with a woman who was not his wife. He lost a considerable amount of money. He was extremely drunk, and he was extremely loud about the fact that he was an actual government official playing in an illegal casino. Marco says this wasn't your fault, but it is your problem. Marco says that this official is now very quiet about the whole thing, which means Marco had a conversation with him, and Marco doesn't have many conversations that don't end with agreement. But agreements costs money. Protection costs money. Money that comes from you. Marco explains that he'd like to acquire a 10% stake in your operation. Not criminal, he clarifies. Not predatory. Just a 10% stake for the headaches of maintaining certain relationships. Certain officials would now understand that it was very important that your operation continue to exist unmolested. Certain police officers would understand that their career prospects were significantly better if they looked the other way. The kid's father would understand that pressing charges in a case involving an illegal gambling operation would be complicated, especially since his son's presence at said gambling operation would need to be thoroughly documented and publicized. You could refuse. You could tell Marco Delgado that you're not interested in his protection, that you'll handle this yourself, that your operation is private and personal and doesn't need organized crime involved. You could do this, and Marco would respect your position. He'd probably even smile. And then, approximately 48 hours later, your largest location would be raided by police officers who had suddenly discovered a moral conscience. Your dealers would disappear, not metaphorically, actually, into a system where they had no reason to protect you since you couldn't protect them. The kid's father would file charges. The gaming commission official would suddenly discover his spine and testify about everything he saw. Your operation would cease to exist, but also you wouldn't cease to exist yet. So you say yes. You say yes to a 10% stake. You say yes to Marco Delgado. You say yes to the thing that every criminal inevitably says yes to, which is the slow process of handing off your independence 1 percentage point at a time. Marco thanks you. He tells you that he has someone who will be visiting your locations to discuss integration. This person will help with logistics. This person will help with money movements. This person will help with situations like the kid's father, who, Marco mentions casually, has already decided that his son lost the money in Atlantic City, not in your operation, because Atlantic City is a legitimate jurisdiction where losses are legally protected. The integration happens smoothly. 1 month in, it's difficult to remember what your operation looked like before Marco's people arrived. 2 months in, you're not entirely sure what decision-making power you actually have anymore. 3 months in, you've stopped thinking about it because thinking about it produces the kind of anxiety that's only solved by saying yes to the next thing Marco needs from you. And then one night, a player sits down at your table, a woman, 50s, expensive jewelry, carries herself like she's used to being obeyed. She plays with technical precision. She wins methodically. She tips your dealers. She talks to nobody. And when she leaves a note for you. The note says, "I'm federal. We've been watching Marco Delgado for 7 years. We'll be talking to you soon." Now you have two masters. Both of them have enough leverage to destroy you. Both of them have already decided that you're useful enough to keep alive, which is the only thing worse than being decided useful enough to kill. You're running a casino empire that technically doesn't exist, for people who officially don't know about it, in a city that's decided the whole thing is probably worth tolerating. The question isn't whether you stay in the game. You're already too deep in the game. The question is whether you're playing chess against Marco Delgado or checkers against the federal government, or three-dimensional poker against everyone at your table simultaneously. The question is how long a person can survive when there is no move they make that isn't wrong. The question is whether you've already made the move that ends this, or whether that move is coming tomorrow. Your phone buzzes again. Different number this time. Text reads, "We need to meet." You don't ask who it is, you already know, and you're already moving toward the door.